Hello everybody, welcome to the first unit of Psych 235. This overview is our introduction to the study of learning and behavior. So let's start by talking about change. The one universal constant is change. Any species must be able to cope with change if it is to survive. Learning then, the subject of this course, is the primary way in which animals and humans deal with change. Now this brings us to natural selection. Natural selection is the selection of features or characteristics that contribute to survival. Charles Darwin was the guy who proposed natural selection, which he said happens through evolution and takes many generations to do anything worthwhile. Darwin specifically proposed his theory in the publication titled On the Origin of Species. Importantly, none of Darwin's theory was based on extensive knowledge of genetics. Some examples of natural selection at work can be seen in the evolution of the human eye and the human brain. The process of natural selection is a crude, inefficient mechanism, so it typically takes countless generations to develop sophisticated tools. In other words, natural selection is slow. Natural selection occurs in response to environmental changes to actually change a species. So, let's go over a few examples of natural selection. In soy sheep, the species has undergone a reduction in size that parallels a change in climate due to global warming. Winters in Scotland have gotten shorter and milder in recent decades, so smaller sheep are now more likely to survive and reproduce. We also see natural selection at work in white sand lizards. See, the white lizards developed lighter skins because they lived in an area with white dunes, whereas their darker-skinned cousins lived better in darker terrain. In white sands, those lizards with lighter skins were more likely to survive and reproduce, and this selection process continued over generations until the lizards in the white dunes were far lighter than their darker-skinned ancestors. Finally, let's talk moths. In peppered moths, nearly all of them were a light gray color at one time, allowing them to easily blend in with the gray trees in the area. The moths that stood out and got eaten were rare black variants. But when pollutants darkened the bark of the trees, the light-colored moths became easiest for predators to spot. The light gray moths were now being eaten, whereas the dark moths tended now to survive and reproduce. In this example, change turned the tables on those moths. Examples aside, it is important for us to know that behavior is also subject to natural selection. As the environment changes, those individuals that behave in adaptive ways are favored, and thus they live on to reproduce. For example, wing flapping while running up trees assists the partridge in getting out of reach of predators. Chicks that flap their wings when attempting to climb trees are more likely to escape predators than those birds that do not use their wings. So, this behavioral tendency of wing flapping is just as likely to be selected as the actual wings are. Now let's define some terms. A reflex is a relationship between a specific event and a simple response to that event. Reflexes are either present at birth or they appear at predictable stages in development. Some adaptive purposes that reflexes serve are protection from injury and food consumption. We typically notice reflexes when they do not work as well as they should. Also, not all reflexes are adaptive, as we see with life-threatening allergies. Clearly, having your throat swell up in response to shellfish is not very useful. Reflexes are also highly stereotypic, meaning that they look the same across the species, as evident in the knee-jerk reflex. However, there is variation within a species. For example, some people's knee-jerk is stronger than others. There is some variation in the form a reflex takes as well, and when it appears. So those are reflexes. Cool. We should also know about modal action patterns. A modal action pattern, or MAP, is a largely inherited series of related acts found in all, or nearly all, members of a species. The event that initiates a MAP, modal action pattern, is called a releaser. Modal action patterns and reflexes share some similarities. Both have a strong genetic basis. Both display relatively little variation from individual to individual, and both are often elicited by a particular kind of event, or stimulus. However, there are also some important differences between modal action patterns and reflexes. MAPs involve the entire organism, whereas reflexes involve just a few muscles or glands. Modal action patterns are more complex, to the point that they often consist of a long series of reflex-like acts. Reflexes alone, though, are much simpler. Plus, although MAPs are still quite stereotypic, they are actually more variable than reflexes are. We should also note something important about modal action patterns. MAPs are not voluntary, intelligent acts. Tropical army ants exemplify this point. These ants follow a chemical trail laid down by the ants in the front of the line, causing the lead ants to gradually move towards the ants beside them. The column of ants then turns into a circle. This is not an intelligent thing to do, but that doesn't matter. It is a modal action pattern. It is not voluntary, it is not intelligent. That doesn't matter. Modal action patterns can be selected by gradual changes in the environment. Some adaptive purposes served by MAPs include protection from predators, as we see in the cat's puff response. Also, protection against the elements, like with the way geese migrate south. Procuring food, as seen in the way that pigs root for grub in the ground. Courtship and mating as well, like with the peacock's mating march. And last but not least, caring and rearing of young, like we see in young ducks who imprint on the mom and the way that Mother Goose incubates her eggs. Now, when it comes to people, there do not appear to be any modal action patterns in humans, because drives for food and sex, among many other things, are too diverse from person to person. Our brains are too big for modal action patterns, too big for instincts. So we've talked about reflexes and modal action patterns. Now, let's talk about general behavior traits. General behavior traits, or GBTs, are the tendencies to engage in certain kinds of behavior. Examples of such tendencies are the tendency to be shy, to be aggressive, cautious, relaxed, or even impulsive. In summary, reflexes are just reflexes, modal action patterns are instincts, and general behavior traits are behavioral tendencies. So let's compare and contrast general behavior traits with modal action patterns. MAPs occur in response to specific releasers, whereas GBTs occur in response to a variety of different stimuli. And GBTs are more variable from individual to individual than MAPs are. Note here is that heredity plays a significant role in the appearance of GBTs. Now let's talk about the limits of natural selection. For one, it is a very slow process. It is of no value whatsoever in helping living individuals cope with change. For example, natural selection does not work fast enough to prevent massive casualties in the face of a highly infectious and deadly disease. The other limit worth noting about natural selection is that because of natural selection, we humans have become hostages to our genetic history. And speaking of genetics, let's talk about mutations. A mutation is an agent of change. It is an abrupt change in genes. Mutations can be caused by exposure to radiation or chemicals, or they can just occur naturally. Mutations are generally not helpful for survival, but because of natural selection, a mutation that does provide a significant advantage may sweep through the population and could potentially ensure the survival of the species. Before we continue, here are some quick notes about genetics. Humans have 46 total chromosomes that are arranged in 23 pairs. 22 pairs are autosomal, while the 23rd pair determines sex. XX is female, XY is male. Now, the genotype is all about the genetic material, while the phenotype is the actual physical expression of that genetic material. This all ties into mutations because some noteworthy mutations that we should know for class include trisomy 21, also known as Down syndrome. This affects both males and females. XO, which is Turner syndrome. Now this affects only females. XXY is Klinefelter syndrome, which affects, again, both males and females, just like Down syndrome. And finally, XYY, which is called the super male, as it affects only males. Again, the genes are the genotypes, while the syndromes themselves are the phenotypes, because they are the physical, outwardly expressed mutations. Now, it's kind of hard to transition from that to the topic we're going on to next, so learning is a change in behavior due to experience. The word change is preferred over acquisition, because learning does not always involve acquiring something, but it does always involve some sort of change. For example, if you learn how to stop biting your nails, you have not acquired a new skill, but you have changed your behavior. Behavior is anything that an organism does that can be measured. In this field, we are limited to behavior that can be measured because that type is the only one that can be scientifically analyzed. Private, covert behavior is defined as behavior that is internalized and unobservable, like thinking, whereas public, overt behavior is behavior that can be outwardly observed. Granted, covert behaviors such as thinking and feeling are not entirely impossible to study scientifically, because we can read people by their body language. This brings us to a common misconception about behaviorism. See, lots of people make the mistake of thinking that behaviorists completely ignore thoughts and feelings. People may think that such apathy results in a lack of empathy for participants in experiments, and even a lack of empathy for those patients who receive treatment. But make no mistake, behaviorists do have hearts. In fact, B.F. Skinner wrote extensively about thoughts and feelings and the importance of including them in an analysis of human behavior. Now, the misconception about cold behaviorists may come from an offshoot branch of behaviorism called radical behaviorism. Radical behaviorism is a school of thought that was created by John B. Watson, who believed that only behavior that could be directly observed was proper to consider in a science of behavior. Well, here's a fun fact. Behaviorists were the first people to treat the poor souls who had been clinically assigned the diagnosis of vegetative idiots and warehoused in desolate institutional settings. Also, a little note here is when it comes to defining behavior, we must remember that there are problems with defining behavior solely in terms of neurological changes. For one, we do not yet fully understand what physiological changes take place when learning occurs. And for another thing, this view denies the importance of behavior in its own right. Okay, we've covered a lot, so let's just keep it going. We're moving on to experience. Experience is defined as changes in the environment. These changes in the environment are events that affect behavior, or that are capable of affecting behavior. Stimuli, then, are physical changes in an organism's environment. The singular form of stimuli, just so you know, is stimulus. Examples of stimuli include the changes in air pressure that we call sound, the light waves that we call sight, and the tactile pressures that we call touch. Now, not all experiences that change behavior are considered examples of learning. A man who is knocked unconscious does not learn to fall fast asleep, but his behavior does change. On that note, let's talk about habituation. Habituation is a reduction in the intensity or probability of a reflex response as a result of repeatedly evoking that response. In other words, habituation is all about getting used to something. For example, jumping in a cold pool repeatedly makes the water feel less cold, so you shiver less as you get used to it. Habituation is helpful for survival because it creates selective attention. Habituation is the simplest form of learning, but it is only temporary. In this way, habituation illustrates the essential nature of learning, that is, a change in behavior due to experience. Now, we shift our focus to the longest-running controversy in the study of behavior, and in psychology in general. That controversy is none other than the nature versus nurture debate. See, the argument is whether behavior is inherited as a product of our genetics or learned as gained through interaction with the environment. We talk about this controversy because the nature-nurture debate is actually a false dichotomy. What that means is that it is an artificial division because it puts two things against one another that do not actually fight. In reality, nature and nurture are not at odds with one another. Instead, they actually work together. For example, both genetics and learning typically contribute to the survival of the individual and the species. Also, just as a side note, geneticists discredit the idea that genes directly cause behavior. So, there's that. Okay, we are almost done with the lecture, so let's just finish up by talking a little bit more about the study of learning and behavior. Learning has been the subject of scientific analysis for little more than 100 years. The natural science approach maintains that learning is a natural phenomenon and that it should be accounted for like any other natural phenomenon. The natural science approach is based on 4 assumptions. 1. All natural phenomena are caused. 2. Causes precede their effects. That's just the nature of cause and effect. 3. The causes of natural events include only natural phenomena, so nothing supernatural here. And 4. The simplest explanation that fits the data is best. In other words, don't make things more complicated than they have to be. Now, when it comes to learning, changes in behavior can be measured on several dimensions. These dimensions include the number of errors that are made, the topography, intensity, speed, latency, rate, also known as frequency, and fluency. Now that may sound like a lot, but we're going to take them on one at a time. Starting with errors. The idea here is that a reduction in errors indicates learning. A rat can be said to have learned to run a maze to the extent that it goes from start to finish without taking a wrong turn. The fewer mistakes that the rat makes, the more we can say that the rat has learned. Now with topography, we are seeing a change in the form that a behavior takes. For example, a person's ability to draw a mirror trace becomes more refined as they practice and learn, leading to a more elegant trace. The form of the trace goes from crude to elegant as the person learns, indicating to us a change in their behavior. Intensity, then, is just about noting the changes in the intensity of a behavior. So when a lab rat learns to press a lever, we may increase the resistance of the lever so that greater force is required from the rat to actually press it down. The increase in pressure that is exerted by the rat shows us how intense the rat's lever press becomes, which in this example is a measure of learning. Speed is probably the one most of us are familiar with. A change in the speed with which a behavior is performed is a key measure of learning. The rat that has learned to run a maze reaches the end of it much faster than an untrained rat. Latency, then, is the time that passes before a behavior occurs. For this, think of how a dog can be taught to drool at the sound of a bell. As the training proceeds, the interval between the bell ringing and the first drop of saliva gets shorter because the dog learns that the bell means dinner, and the thought of dinner makes the dog drool. So the quicker that the action we're looking for happens, the more we can say that the animal has learned. Then we have rate. This is just the number of occurrences per unit of time. For example, a pigeon may peck a disc at the rate of 5 to 10 times per minute. The experimenter may then attempt to increase or decrease the rate of disc pecking. The resulting change in rate is a measure of learning. Finally, fluency is just how fluent you become at something. So think of how fluently you speak a language or read from a book. You do these things with ease because your fluency increased as you learned the language. Talking a little bit more about rate, the rate of behavior is an especially useful measure of learning because it allows us to see subtle changes in behavior. Researchers used to use a device called a Cumulative Recorder to tally behavior rate. It worked by placing a pen on a moving sheet of paper, so that the pen made a constant straight line. A steady pace indicated no behavior change. But when a behavior change did occur, for example, when a rat pressed a lever, the pen moved a short distance at a right angle to the length of the paper. The higher the rate of behavior, the more pen movements and the steeper the slope of the ink line. The lower the rate, the flatter the line. So, in short, a cumulative recorder provides us a measure of the change in the rate of behavior, or learning. Now, I use the past tense when talking about this device because the cumulative recorder has now been replaced by computer software. Because of course it has. Okay, with all of these concepts covered, let's talk about research. Research designs are means by which to gather evidence about natural phenomena, including learning. An experiment is a study in which a researcher manipulates one or more variables and measures the effects of this manipulation on one or more other variables. Independent variables are the variables that the researcher manipulates. For example, the amount of exercise a participant engages in. On the flip side are dependent variables, which are the variables that are allowed to vary freely. For example, how that participant's mood changes relative to the amount of exercise that they get. Understanding experiments lets us understand the essential elements of a between subjects design, which are 1. The independent variable must differ across the groups, and 2. Any differences in the dependent variable are assumed to be the result of differences in exposure to the independent variable. Experimental control in between subjects experiments is demonstrated using statistics. Results are also typically analyzed with statistics. Pre-treatment differences are accounted for with random assignment and matched sampling. In these between subjects designs, many participants are needed because each participant must be matched to another person. Now, the alternative to the between subjects design is called the within subjects experimental design, also known as the single subject design. The essential elements of a within subjects design are 1. The independent variable varies within the participants, such that each participant is in the experimental group and they are in the control group at different times. And 2. Any differences in the dependent variable are presumed to be the result of differences in experiences at different times. A baseline period is included to rule out the possibility that behavior is affected by extraneous factors. In other words, stuff outside what the experiment is actually about. In a within subjects design, participants' behavior is measured before exposure to the independent variable as a baseline measure, and then during or after whatever treatment they receive. Each participant serves as their own control, when it comes to within subjects designs, that is. A similar design to this is the ABA reversal design, in which the experimenter may return to the baseline condition after already passing through the experimental condition, hence the title ABA. In a sense, the researcher repeats the experiment within the same study. Back to the within subjects design, results here are typically analyzed with graphs, not stats. Pre-treatment individual differences are accounted for by comparing participants against themselves. Not as many participants are needed for within subjects designs because each participant is only compared to themselves. Again, single subject. Behaviorists almost exclusively use within subjects designs in their research because it allows for the greatest control of individual differences. So let's compare and contrast between subjects and within subjects. For starters, between subjects analyze data with statistical measures, whereas within subjects data is analyzed using only graphs. Between subjects experiments also require more participants than do within subjects designs. Finally, individual differences are a greater concern for between subjects designs, which deal with them using random assignment and matched sampling. Within subjects designs instead just compare participants against themselves. The last point that we will cover today is a limit of laboratory work. See, one major limitation of lab experiments is that the environments in which they are carried out are too artificial to be applied to the real world. That point has been the subject of a lot of criticism. However, this limitation is mediated by conducting field experiments that coincide with the lab work. So, by doing tests in the real world that parallel work being done in the lab, researchers are able to make real progress this way. Okay, that is going to do it for this overview of the first unit of Psych 235. Thank you all for watching. This has been our introduction to the study of learning and behavior.